So the other day I finished a brand new quilt top and I spread it out to admire it and realized that one of the blocks was just not right. It just didn't suit the quilt. It was too dark and it was really an eyesore in the quilt. And maybe you've had that experience, or maybe you've had a quilt block that's rotated the wrong way and you didn't realize it until the whole quilt top was finished. Well, today I'm going to show you how to surgically remove that one block and replace it without having to take apart the whole quilt. It will save you a ton of time and it's a great skill to have. So I have this 16 patch that we are going to pretend is a whole quilt so that we can fit it all in the camera. And I'm going to replace one of these blocks with a new block. So this is the block that we're going to be removing today and replacing. So I've just drawn an X on it so I remember which one it is. And we need to remove the seams just around this block. So I'm going to start on the back of this quilt. So when we look at the back of our quilt top, we need to figure out in what order we sewed these blocks together, because it looks like I assembled this quilt top by making 4 patches, and then I sewed 4 patches together to create this quilt top. But I very easily could have a quilt top here that's assembled in rows by these 4 blocks being sewn into a row and then these rows being joined together. It doesn't matter how you assembled your quilt, you just need to figure out which seams you're going to attack first. So this seam right here is one of the last seams that I sewed because it goes all the way across here without a break. And then it looks like, see how I can't flip this seam allowance over because it's sewn down by that line? That means that the seam on top was sewn more recently. So this was the last seam, and then this was the second to last seam because it's sewn down and trapped by that final seam. So I'm going to go ahead and just start with this most recent seam. I'm going to open it up just along the side of the block that I need to remove. So I'm going to give myself about an inch or 2 on either side. So I'm going to rip the seam from here to here. I'm going to start in the middle, and I'm just going to pop a couple of stitches, and you can use whatever seam ripping method you are most comfortable with. I like to get myself a little opening. I've removed maybe 8 or so stitches, and I have a little opening now into that seam. And now I can slip my seam ripper between and make a little bit quicker work. Now, I don't recommend this method if this quilt block or quilt top is super precious or this fabric is irreplaceable, because there is a chance you could slice through your fabric. But I am just going to ease this open and give myself just a little bit of room on either side. So I've gone about an inch beyond this seam. Now I'm going to rotate it and open it up the other way. So now I have access to this side of the block, and we're a quarter of the way to having it free. Now I need to decide which seam I'm going to tackle next. And I'm looking for a seam that I can rip all the way across past the edge of the block. This one is a good candidate. This seam goes all the way across. I can flatten it nicely in my hands. This one, see how this one, when I fold my work at the seam, I have this weird part here where the seams don't want to come together. They don't want to be flat above the work like they do here. So I know that I need to do a little bit of work before I can get to this seam. And I'm guessing I'm going to rip around here and then this way and then back to free this block. Some of this is trial and error. If I started to rip this seam and got to this point and it just wasn't working, then I can always pause and rip another seam. Somehow this block is going to come out. So just keep trying. If you hit a little bit of a roadblock, tackle it from the other side or another angle, and eventually we're going to get this block out. So I have ripped this side and I have this side of my block that I'm removing open, and now I have access to this seam. Once you get one open, then as soon as you have access to another seam, you can just start working. And usually there's a pretty clear path around your block. Okay, I am at my final seam. I know this is a little hard to see, but here we are. I have freed 3 sides of my block, and I just have this one to go, and it's totally accessible. Both ends are available to me, so I can just rip across, and then I will have a quilt top with a hole in it. There we go. Our X'd off block has been removed from our quilt, and we can set it aside. So now we have a quilt top with a hole in it, and we need to fill that hole with a new block. I have this red one here, so it's really obvious how I am working. We need to sew this new block into our hole in the reverse order that we ripped these seams. So if we take a look at what we have 4 edges here, but we only have one that is totally accessible to us. Both of the edges are available. This is like creating and then finishing a partial seam project. We're just going to sew the seams that we have available to us first, and this is the only one. So I am going to fold the rest of this block out of the way, and I am only going to concern myself with these edges. And I'm going to put my fabrics right sides together, and I'm going to sew this complete seam from edge to edge, pretending like the rest of this block isn't there. And if you need to give this background, this white piece, a bit of a press so that it's not all wobbly on you, then you certainly can. I like to use pins pretty liberally here since there is a lot of folding and just a lot of stuff to keep track of since we have this whole block in our way. And now I'm going to sew this with a 1/4 of an inch seam. We've made some progress. We have one seam done. So now we need to look for the next seam that is completely available to us. And it looks like it is this seam because I have the corner of this white block exposed to me. So I can ignore all of this and sew this seam. I already have it started. Remember, I didn't rip it all the way out. So I am going to fold this seam together. And so from about here, I'm going to overlap my stitches just a little bit all the way to the end of this block and finish this seam. So let's fold that together, line up our edges just like we normally would. You can see I already have the seam started. I'm going to pick up here and continue to the edge. %50 of the way there, just 2 more seams to go. And again, we're just looking for the next seam that has a corner available to us that we can completely finish. And it looks like we're going top to bottom here. So I'm going to repeat that same process. I'm going to fold my quilt at that seam, align the edges. I have the corner of this white square available to me that matches up with the corner of my block. And I'm going to finish the seam that is still partially intact. I'm going to start here and sew to the edge. And I'm just going to ignore this little flap of the completed quilt. You need to pin it out of the way. Like if this is a large quilt, you can certainly take some clips and just clip it out of the way so you don't accidentally sew it. But I like to just work at my sewing machine, making sure that I'm only sewing through two layers of fabric. This one is pretty wrinkled, and I'm going to give it a quick press just to make lining this up a little bit easier. We are in the final stretch. We have our block attached on 3 sides, and now we just need to finish this final seam. We don't have any corners attached, but we don't need any corners attached because we are just going to fold this in half right at that open slit seam line, and it all comes together really nicely. I'm going to give this a little press just so it lays nice and flat. And then I'm going to sew from about here to about here to completely close the seam. And then we are done. We are done. I have my new block completely set into my quilt top, and it looks perfect. You would never know that this was a replacement square. This is a skill that has saved me a lot of time because I have sewn blocks into the wrong places or rotated them incorrectly multiple times, and I know it will save you a lot of time as well. I will join you again very soon with another video. So until then, happy quilting!